When a Marine veteran returns from the hospital to find his house empty and his family gone, he faces a mystery that tests his strength and resilience. What unfolds is a fight for justice that reveals a shocking betrayal and an unbreakable bond. How will this Marine uncover the truth and reunite with his loved ones? Daniel Foster gripped the railing of the hospital steps, his newly issued cane steady in his hand. Every step forward was a reminder of how far he'd come, both from his injuries and the months of rehabilitation that followed. His body bore the marks of his service, the faint limp in his walk, the ache in his shoulder that never seemed to go away. But today wasn't about the pain. It was about going home. For months, the hospital room had been his world. It was sterile, filled with distant sounds of machines beeping and the occasional voices of nurses. He had learned to ignore the small television in the corner and instead spent his time flipping through photos on his phone. Each image of Laura and their two kids, Sophie and Caleb, had been his anchor. They'd sent him videos. Sophie showing off her school art projects. Caleb riding his bike for the first time without training wheels. He had watched those clips over and over, imagining the hugs, the laughter, the smell of pancakes Laura always made on Sunday mornings. The ride home was quiet. Daniel's driver, a volunteer from a local veteran organization, gave him the space he seemed to need. Daniel's hands rested on the folded discharge papers in his lap, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He pictured Sophie rushing to the door, Caleb probably leaping into his arms before he even stepped inside. Laura would stand back for a moment, smiling, letting the kids have their moment before hugging him in that way that made him feel invincible, no matter what the world threw at him. As the car pulled up to his house, Daniel felt a strange sense of calm. He stared at the familiar facade, the blue shutters Laura loved and the small flower bed she had insisted on planting. Everything looked exactly as it had in his memory. With his cane in hand, Daniel stepped out, a smile tugging at his lips. He was home. He was ready. The door opened, and nothing could prepare him for what he saw inside. The creak of the front door echoed unnervingly as Daniel stepped inside. His smile faded almost immediately, replaced by confusion. The familiar warmth he had envisioned, the sound of the kids playing, Laura calling out from the kitchen, was replaced by silence. Cold, unsettling silence. The living room was bare, no couch, no photos on the walls, not even the rug that Caleb had spilled juice on the year before. Daniel blinked, thinking maybe he'd walked into the wrong house. But there was the scuff on the floor near the doorway, a mark he had made while moving a bookshelf last Christmas. This was his home, but it felt foreign, lifeless. "Laura?" he called out, his voice breaking the stillness. No response. Daniel moved further in, gripping his cane tightly. The kitchen was just as empty, the counters bare, the cabinets hanging open and stripped of dishes. He ran his hand along the counter, half expecting Laura to pop out from behind a corner and yell, "Surprise!" But no one came. The only sound was the faint echo of his cane tapping against the tiled floor. He climbed the stairs slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. The children's bedrooms, once chaotic with toys and clothes, were now hollow spaces. Caleb's superhero posters were gone, and Sophie's shelves, once lined with books and art supplies, were bare. He stood frozen in the doorway, a sinking dread washing over him. Daniel made his way to the master bedroom. The bed frame was there, but the mattress was missing. On the floor, there was an outline in the dust where Laura's jewelry box used to sit. He dropped into the empty space where their bed had been, his mind racing. Pulling out his phone, Daniel tried to call Laura. It went straight to voicemail. Again and again. His fingers trembled as he scrolled through their last texts. Short updates, cheerful pictures of the kids. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Then he noticed the missed calls, a series of them. The last one, from nearly a week ago, was marked urgent. Why hadn't he seen it? He stared at the phone, a hollow pit forming in his chest. Something was very, very wrong. Daniel sat on the floor of the empty bedroom, his phone clutched tightly in his hand. He replayed Laura's missed calls in his mind, each one now taking on a more urgent tone. His chest tightened as he scrolled through his messages again, hoping he had missed something, a clue, a sign, anything. Dragging himself up, he moved back downstairs, his cane tapping rhythmically on the wooden stairs. He searched the living room first, his eyes scanning every corner. Nothing. Then the kitchen. His fingers grazed the edges of the counters, opening and closing every drawer. The emptiness felt suffocating, like a hollow shell of the life he had left behind. In the corner of the kitchen, near the base of the refrigerator, a piece of paper caught his eye. It was folded and slightly crumpled, as if it had been hastily discarded. Daniel crouched down and picked it up, his pulse quickening. The handwriting was unmistakably Laura's. "Daniel, I'm sorry. I had no choice. Please, trust Jake. He'll know what to do. Don't believe anything they tell you. Protect the kids." He read it again, the weight of her words sinking in. No choice? Trust Jake? Protect the kids? His heart raced as questions swirled in his mind. What could have forced Laura to leave like this? And who were? Daniel moved to the front door, his eyes landing on the doorbell camera. Suddenly he remembered. The camera might have recorded everything. He pulled out his phone and opened the app, navigating to the footage. His fingers hovered over the screen as he hit play. The first few clips were mundane. Mail being delivered, a neighborhood cat wandering by. But then he saw it, a moving truck parked in the driveway. Two unfamiliar men stepped out, their movements hurried. Laura appeared in the frame next, holding Caleb's hand while Sophie clutched her arm. She looked panicked, glancing around as if someone was watching. The men loaded furniture while Laura stood by, helpless. Daniel's jaw tightened. Someone had forced them out. Whoever they were, they had taken his family. And now it was up to him to find them. Daniel sat at the kitchen table, his phone propped up against a salt shaker as he replayed the doorbell footage. His hands clenched tightly, knuckles white as he scrutinized every detail of the video. The sight of Laura's distressed face haunted him. Her hurried movements, the way she clutched Caleb and Sophie as if shielding them, told him that she hadn't left willingly. The men loading the truck were strangers, muscular, no-nonsense types who moved with efficiency. They weren't ordinary movers. Daniel's mind raced with possibilities. Were they criminals? Enforcers? Whoever they were, they handled his family's belongings like they were disposable, tossing furniture carelessly into the truck. He rewound the footage, pausing at a critical moment. One of the men turned to Laura and spoke, his hand gesturing aggressively. She nodded reluctantly, then glanced toward the camera. For the briefest moment, their eyes seemed to meet through the lens. Her expression was a mix of fear and desperation, but there was something else, a silent plea. "Why didn't I notice this sooner?" Daniel muttered, his voice trembling with frustration. He tapped to fast forward, scanning the remaining footage for any other clues. Hours later, the same truck pulled away, leaving the driveway barren. It was as if his family had been erased. He scrolled further back in the video history, combing through the days he'd been in the hospital. That's when he noticed something chilling. The same truck had visited before. A few days earlier, it had parked in the same spot, but no one had come out of the house. Instead, a man in a suit emerged from the passenger seat, clipboard in hand. He walked up to the door and spoke to Laura. This time, the sound was barely audible, but Daniel strained to hear it. Words like eviction, arrears, and seized assets floated through the garbled audio. It didn't make sense. Laura had paid the rent religiously, and they weren't behind on any bills. The man handed Laura some paperwork, which she reluctantly accepted. Tears glistened on her face as she shut the door. Daniel's breathing quickened. Someone had manipulated his family, using threats and deception. He couldn't stop replaying Laura's expression, her fear, her helplessness. He knew one thing for sure: whoever had done this didn't expect him to come home. Closing the app, Daniel made a decision. He needed to find Jake. Whatever was happening, he wouldn't face it alone, and he wouldn't stop until he brought his family home. The confrontation with Martin Dempsey had left Daniel fired up and Jake even more determined. They both knew Dempsey wouldn't back down quietly, and his veiled threats confirmed he wasn't afraid to escalate. But Daniel wasn't fighting this battle alone anymore. The next step was to turn the spotlight on Dempsey and expose his predatory schemes to the broader community. Back at Daniel's empty house, Jake sat cross-legged on the floor, his laptop perched on a stack of cardboard boxes. Daniel stood nearby, leaning on his cane, reviewing a list of names and contacts Jake had compiled from his investigation. These were people who had suffered at Dempsey's hands: evicted veterans, single parents, retirees, and struggling families. Some had... "We need to make this public," Jake said, typing rapidly. "Dempsey's operated in the shadows for too long. If we get the community behind us, his empire will start to crumble." Daniel nodded. "Let's start with the veteran groups. If they see one of their own standing up, they'll know they're not alone." Jake sent emails and messages to local organizations, including a few veteran advocacy groups he had worked with in the past. Within hours, responses began flooding in. Several were outraged by what they heard, eager to help. One group offered legal advice, while another volunteered to organize a rally. The rally was scheduled for 2 days later at a local park. In the meantime, Daniel and Jake worked tirelessly to spread the word. They visited small businesses and churches, handing out flyers and speaking to anyone who would listen. Daniel's military background lent him credibility, and his genuine passion for justice resonated with those who heard his story. By the time the rally arrived, the park was filled with people. Veterans in uniform stood side by side with families, holding signs that read, "Justice for Veterans" and "Stop Dempsey's Exploitation." Local reporters circled the crowd, interviewing attendees and snapping photos. The energy was electric, a wave of solidarity and outrage. Jake took the microphone first, explaining the pattern of abuse and corruption that Dempsey had perpetrated. He laid out the evidence with precision, highlighting the forged documents and testimonies from victims. Then he handed the microphone to Daniel, who stepped forward, his heart pounding. "I came home after months in the hospital to find my house empty and my family gone," Daniel began, his voice steady despite the emotion in his words. "What I've learned since then is that this isn't just about me. This is about every family that's been threatened, every veteran who's been exploited, and every community that's been torn apart by greed." The crowd erupted in applause, and Daniel continued. "We served this country. We sacrificed for it. And now it's time to stand together, to protect each other. Dempsey thinks he can silence us, but today we're proving him wrong." As the crowd cheered, Daniel felt a sense of unity he hadn't experienced since leaving the Marines. This wasn't just a fight for his family. It was a fight for everyone who had been wronged. The media coverage ensured that Dempsey couldn't hide any longer. The pressure was mounting, and Daniel was ready for what came next. That night, as Daniel and Jake reviewed the day's events, Daniel felt a renewed sense of hope. "Dempsey knows we're serious now," he said. Jake smirked. "Oh, he knows. And he's running out of places to hide." The next morning, Daniel woke to the sound of Jake's truck pulling into the driveway. Jake stepped out, a thick folder tucked under his arm, his expression grim. Daniel met him at the door, his heart sinking at the sight of his old friend's furrowed brow. Whatever Jake had uncovered wasn't good. "I made a few calls last night," Jake began as he set the folder on the table. He flipped it open, revealing papers, photos, and a few typed notes. "Your family isn't the first to go through this. There's a pattern here, and it's ugly." Daniel leaned in, scanning the documents. Jake had compiled eviction notices, court filings, and testimonies from other families. The same landlord's name appeared repeatedly: Martin Dempsey. "This guy's been targeting families like yours," Jake explained. "Veterans, single parents, anyone he thinks is too overwhelmed to fight back. He's using forged documents, claiming unpaid rent or false maintenance issues to justify evictions. By the time his victims realize what's happening, their homes are already empty." Daniel's jaw tightened. How is he getting away with this? Doesn't anyone check these claims? Jake nodded grimly. He's smart. Keeps it just legal enough to slip under the radar. Most families don't have the money to challenge him in court, And even if they do, it takes months. Meanwhile, he flips the property or jacks up the rent. Daniel felt a surge of anger rise in his chest. This guy picked the wrong family to mess with. Jake tapped a specific document. He's gotten bolder lately, targeting veterans. People think we're strong enough to handle anything, but Dempsey's counting on the fact that we're spread thin, recovering from injuries, dealing with VA bureaucracy, trying to keep our families together. The room fell silent for a moment as Daniel processed the magnitude of what Jake was saying. This wasn't just about him or his family, it was about every person Dempsey had exploited. "What about Laura and the kids?" Daniel asked finally, his voice steady but laced with urgency. "Where are they now?" Jake hesitated. "That's the one piece I haven't nailed down yet, but I've got a lead. A property Dempsey owns about 40 miles from here. If Laura needed a safe place to take the kids, she might have gone there." Daniel stood, his resolve hardening. "Then that's where we're going next." Jake grabbed his keys, his eyes meeting Daniel's. "We're not just going to find your family. We're going to make sure this guy can't do this to anyone else ever again." With that, they headed out the door, determined to uncover the rest of the truth and bring Dempsey's operation crashing down. Daniel and Jake pulled into the gravel driveway of the address Jake had tracked down, a worn-down rental property owned by Martin Dempsey. The place looked abandoned, with peeling paint and broken shutters that rattled in the wind. It wasn't what Daniel had imagined when he thought of a safe haven for his family, but it was a lead. They stepped out of the truck, both scanning their surroundings, their instincts honed from years of training. Jake carried the folder of evidence under his arm, while Daniel, still leaning on his cane, let his determination carry him forward. The front door was locked, but Jake knocked firmly, his knuckles striking the wood with authority. After a long pause, it creaked open to reveal a young woman in her 20s, her face pale and weary. She clutched a small child to her side, her gaze darting nervously between the two men. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling. "We're looking for Martin Dempsey," Daniel said, his tone steady but firm. "Do you know where he is?" The woman hesitated, then shook her head. "He doesn't come here, just sends people when he needs something. Are you with him?" "No," Jake interjected quickly. "We're trying to stop him. You're not the only one he's hurt." Her shoulders sagged in relief. "He evicted my sister last month. Said she owed back rent, but it wasn't true. He took everything." Jake nodded, scribbling a note on his pad. "We'll make sure this stops. But we need more information. Did you see or hear anything about a woman named Laura and her 2 kids? The woman's face softened. "I did. She came by a few days ago looking for a place to stay. Dempsey sent his men to chase her off." Daniel's heart sank. "Where did they go?" "I don't know," the woman replied, "but she left in a hurry, like she was afraid." Daniel clenched his fists. They were close, but Dempsey had already pushed Laura further away. He thanked the woman, then returned to the truck with Jake, frustration etched into every step he took. "This guy's not just a crook," Daniel muttered as they drove away. "He's a predator." Jake nodded. "And predators like him rely on fear. It's time to change that." Later that day, Jake used his contacts to arrange a meeting with Dempsey. They had enough evidence to confront him directly and make him nervous. When the time came, Daniel and Jake stood outside Dempsey's sleek office building, the contrast stark compared to the rundown homes he owned. The landlord was waiting in his corner office, a smug smile plastered across his face as they entered. "Well, if it isn't the Marine and his sidekick," Dempsey sneered. "What can I do for you gentlemen?" Daniel stepped forward, his voice low but charged with authority. "You've stolen from me, threatened my family, and destroyed the lives of people who trusted you. It ends now." Dempsey leaned back, feigning indifference. "You don't have proof of anything." Jake slammed the folder on the desk, spilling its contents. Documents, photographs, and testimonials. "We have more than proof, and the law's about to catch up with you." Dempsey's smirk faltered, but he recovered quickly. "You think you can intimidate me? I've dealt with tougher than you." Daniel stepped closer, locking eyes with him. You don't know tough until you've faced a Marine with nothing left to lose. For a moment, Dempsey seemed rattled, but his arrogance returned. You'll regret this. Daniel didn't flinch. Not as much as you will. As they left, Jake whispered, He's scared. He'll try something, but now he knows we're coming for him. Daniel's jaw tightened. Good. Let him. The confrontation with Martin Dempsey had left Daniel fired up and Jake even more determined. They both knew Dempsey wouldn't back down quietly, and his veiled threats confirmed he wasn't afraid to escalate. But Daniel wasn't fighting this battle alone anymore. The next step was to turn the spotlight on Dempsey and expose his predatory schemes to the broader community. Back at Daniel's empty house, Jake sat cross-legged on the floor, his laptop perched on a stack of cardboard boxes. Daniel stood nearby, leaning on his cane, reviewing a list of names and contacts Jake had compiled from his investigation. These were people who had suffered at Dempsey's hands: evicted veterans, single parents, retirees, and struggling families. Some had been silenced by fear or defeat, but others had stories they were ready to share. We need to make this public, Jake said, typing rapidly. Dempsey's operated in the shadows for too long. If we get the community behind us, his empire will start to crumble. Daniel nodded. Let's start with the veteran groups. If they see one of their own standing up, they'll know they're not alone. Jake sent emails and messages to local organizations, including a few veteran advocacy groups he had worked with in the past. Within hours, responses began flooding in. Several were outraged by what they heard, eager to help. One group offered legal advice, while another volunteered to organize a rally. The rally was scheduled for 2 days later at a local park. In the meantime, Daniel and Jake worked tirelessly to spread the word. They visited small businesses and churches, handing out flyers and speaking to anyone who would listen. Daniel's military background lent him credibility, and his genuine passion for justice resonated with those who heard his story. By the time the rally arrived, the park was filled with people. Veterans in uniform stood side by side with families, holding signs that read, "Justice for Veterans," and "Stop Dempsey's Exploitation." Local reporters circled the crowd, interviewing attendees and snapping photos. The energy was electric, a wave of solidarity and outrage. Jake took the microphone first, explaining the pattern of abuse and corruption that Dempsey had perpetrated. He laid out the evidence with precision, highlighting the forged documents and testimonies from victims. Then he handed the microphone to Daniel, who stepped forward, his heart pounding. I came home after months in the hospital to find my house empty and my family gone, Daniel began, his voice steady despite the emotion in his words. What I've learned since then is that this isn't just about me. This is about every family that's been threatened, every veteran who's been exploited, and every community that's been torn apart by greed. The crowd erupted in applause, and Daniel continued. We served this country. We sacrificed for it. And now it's time to stand together to protect each other. Dempsey thinks he can silence us, but today we're proving him wrong. As the crowd cheered, Daniel felt a sense of unity he hadn't experienced since leaving the Marines. This wasn't just a fight for his family. It was a fight for everyone who had been wronged. The media coverage ensured that Dempsey couldn't hide any longer. The pressure was mounting, and Daniel was ready for what came next. That night, as Daniel and Jake reviewed the day's events, Daniel felt a renewed sense of hope. Dempsey knows we're serious now, he said. Jake smirked. Oh, he knows, and he's running out of places to hide. The fallout from the rally was immediate. Local news outlets ran stories about the growing movement against Martin Dempsey, while social media posts about the rally went viral. The community's outrage was palpable, and Dempsey's name became synonymous with corruption and greed. But for Daniel and Jake, this was only the beginning. They knew Dempsey wouldn't go down without a fight. 2 days after the rally, Daniel received a call from one of Jake's contacts. Dempsey's planning something, the voice on the other end warned. He's nervous. My guess, he's going to try to cover his tracks or retaliate. Daniel relayed the message to Jake, who smirked. Good. If he's making moves, it means we're close to cornering him. Later that day, Daniel and Jake reviewed the evidence one more time. They had compiled a dossier thick with incriminating documents, including eviction notices with forged signatures, testimonies from victims, and financial records showing kickbacks from shady property deals. Armed with this, they contacted a local law firm that specialized in defending veterans. The firm agreed to take the case pro bono, citing the overwhelming public support and the clear need for justice. Jake arranged a meeting with Dempsey's legal team, forcing a showdown in the landlord's office. When they arrived, they were met with hostility. Dempsey sat behind a massive mahogany desk, flanked by two lawyers. His smirk was gone, replaced by a tight-lipped expression that betrayed his unease. "You've caused quite a stir," Dempsey said, his voice dripping with disdain. "But you're in over your heads. You have no idea who you're dealing with." Jake stepped forward, placing the thick dossier on the desk. "We know exactly who we're dealing with, and we've got everything we need to prove it." Dempsey's lawyers flipped through the pages, their faces growing increasingly grim as they read. One whispered something into Dempsey's ear, but he waved them off, his bravado faltering. "This doesn't prove anything," Dempsey snapped, but his voice lacked conviction. Daniel leaned on his cane, staring Dempsey down. "You've been stealing from people who trusted you, preying on families and veterans who were already struggling. It ends now." "You think you're heroes?" Dempsey sneered, though his voice cracked slightly. "This'll never hold up in court." Jake grinned. "We don't need it to hold up in court yet. The media's already running with this story. The community knows what you've done. It's only a matter of time before law enforcement steps in." As if on cue, the office door opened and two uniformed police officers walked in. One of them handed Dempsey a warrant. "Martin Dempsey, you're under arrest for fraud, forgery, and other charges pending investigation." Dempsey's face went pale. "This is ridiculous. I have rights," he shouted as the officers handcuffed him. His lawyers scrambled to protest, but the officers were firm. Daniel watched as Dempsey was led out of the office, a mixture of relief and triumph washing over him. It wasn't just about seeing the man brought to justice. It was about standing up for every person who had been wronged. Outside, Jake clapped a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "You did it, man. You brought him down." Danny shook his head. "We did it, and we're not done yet. There's still work to do for the families he hurt." As the sun set on the day, Daniel felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just a victory. It was a new beginning. The drive to the small town where Laura and the kids were staying felt longer than it was. Daniel sat in the passenger seat of Jake's truck, the weight of the past few weeks pressing down on him. The arrest of Martin Dempsey had been a major victory, but the emotional toll of the ordeal still lingered. His thoughts kept returning to Laura's note, her fear, and the uncertainty his family must have felt. "Almost there," Jake said, breaking the silence. "They're going to be over the moon to see." Daniel nodded but said nothing. His heart raced as they pulled up to a modest house on the outskirts of town. The yard was simple but tidy, and Daniel spotted a pair of small bicycles leaning against the side of the porch. Seeing them brought a wave of emotions he wasn't prepared for. Jake stayed in the truck, giving Daniel the moment to himself. With his cane in one hand and a deep breath filling his lungs, Daniel made his way to the front door. He raised his hand to knock but hesitated, the thought of how much they'd been through weighing heavily on him. Finally, he knocked. The door opened slowly, and there she was. Laura's face lit up the second she saw him, her eyes welling with tears. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice trembling as she threw her arms around him. The embrace was tight, as though she was afraid to let go, and Daniel held her just as fiercely. "Daddy!" Sophie's voice rang out from inside the house, followed by the sound of little feet thundering toward the door. Caleb wasn't far behind, his face breaking into a wide grin as he ran into Daniel's open arms. "You're home!" Sophie exclaimed, hugging his waist as Caleb clung to his leg. "I'm home," Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm never letting anything happen to us again." Inside, they sat together on the worn couch, Laura explaining the hardships they'd faced while Daniel had been in the hospital. She described how Dempsey's men had shown up with eviction notices and threats, leaving her no choice but to flee with the kids. It hadn't been safe to reach out, but she had hoped Daniel would find the note and understand. "I never stopped believing you'd come for us," she said, wiping away a tear. "I just didn't know how long it would take." Daniel reached for her hand, his grip firm. "I'll never leave you to face anything alone again. We've got a whole community behind us now, and Dempsey's not going to hurt anyone else." In the weeks that followed, the town rallied around Daniel's family. Volunteers helped restore their home, and local veterans pitched in to replace what had been lost. The media attention from Dempsey's arrest also spurred changes in local policies, ensuring landlords like him could no longer exploit vulnerable families. One sunny afternoon, as Daniel watched Sophie and Caleb playing in the backyard, Laura joined him on the porch. "What's next for you?" she asked. Daniel thought for a moment, gazing at his children. "I think it's time I pay it forward. There are other veterans out there who need someone to fight for them, like Jake did for me. I can't change what happened, but I can make sure no one else goes through it alone." Lauda smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "You're a good man, Daniel Foster." He wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. "I'm just a Marine who loves his family." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Daniel felt something he hadn't in a long time: peace. His family was safe, justice had been served, and he had found a new purpose. No matter what lay ahead, he knew they would face it together, stronger than ever.